The late morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel lot of a small-town church nestled in the heart of rural Texas. A white sign out front read, New Hope Community Chapel. Everyone welcome. The paint slightly faded, the word welcome partially chipped. As the clock neared 10 o'clock in the morning, families began streaming into the chapel, dressed in their Sunday best. Men in button-ups and slacks. Women in floral dresses and soft pastels. Children with combed hair and restless feet. Among them walked Emily Dawson, 27 years old, her chestnut hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She wore a light blue blouse that clung slightly to her frame and a pair of faded jeans, frayed near the knees. Her sneakers were scuffed, and the strap of her worn canvas bag dug into her shoulder. She paused near the entrance, watching people step inside, some greeting each other with warm smiles, others already deep in conversation. No one greeted her. She reached for the church door handle, took a steadying breath, and entered. The murmurs began almost immediately. It wasn't loud, just a few whispers, exchanged glances, a tightening of lips. A woman in her 60s wearing a wide-brimmed hat gave a slow, scrutinizing look, then leaned toward her friend and said something under her breath. Two teenage girls near the aisle giggled and quickly turned away when Emily noticed them. Her steps slowed. She had hoped the message on the sign was true. That everyone really did mean everyone. Emily found a seat near the back, alone, her shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing for a blow. She tried to focus on the soft music coming from the piano near the altar, but her pulse was loud in her ears. The pews were filling quickly now. More people noticed her. More glances. More whispers. Then, just before the pastor appeared on stage, an older woman, small in stature but imposing in presence, approached her pew. She wore a pink cardigan and carried a leather-bound Bible with worn corners. "Excuse me, dear," the woman said with a tight smile. "We are so glad to see new faces, of course. But perhaps next time you might consider dressing a bit more appropriately. We do try to honor the Lord in all things, even our appearance." Emily blinked. She nodded slowly, her voice catching as she managed. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." The woman offered a shallow nod and returned to her seat. Emily stared down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. Shame, hot and sharp, crept into her cheeks. She wasn't unaware of how she looked. She just hadn't imagined it would matter this much. She had spent the morning trying to choose the cleanest outfit from the few she owned. She had even ironed the blouse with a borrowed iron at the shelter. As the service began, her mind was already wandering toward the door. She didn't belong here. She had made a mistake. The pastor hadn't even begun his sermon yet, and already she felt like an intruder. Then he spoke. From the stage, Pastor John Miller greeted the congregation with familiar, practiced warmth. A man in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair, and a voice that carried without needing a microphone. He welcomed everyone, gave the weekly announcements, and read the day's scripture passage. But then, after a short pause, he scanned the pews, his eyes landing briefly, deliberately, on the back row. "This morning," he said, his voice steady, "I noticed something that troubled me deeply. Before the sermon even began, I saw a judgment in this house of God. I saw it not in words, but in glances, in whispers, in postures." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. "I wonder," he continued, "how many of us truly understand the meaning of grace, if our first instinct when seeing someone different is to question whether they belong?" Emily's breath caught. She felt every eye turning again, but this time not in mockery, but in recognition of the pastor's words. Pastor Miller stepped away from the pulpit slightly and said, "There's someone here today who I believe has a story to tell, and if she's willing, I would love for her to come forward and introduce herself, not because she owes us anything, but because I think we have something to learn." The silence in the church was absolute. Emily's heart thundered. Her palms were slick with sweat. She could have stayed seated. No one expected her to stand. No one would have blamed her if she slipped out quietly before the final hymn. But something about the way the pastor had spoken, firm but kind, disappointed but not condemning, struck a nerve she had tried to keep buried. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the pew in front of her. Slowly, she rose. She could feel her knees shaking beneath her jeans, could hear the faint intake of breath from those around her. She didn't know what she was going to say. She only knew that if she didn't speak now, she might never come back again. And so, with hesitant steps and her head held just high enough not to crumble, Emily Dawson began to walk down the aisle toward the pulpit. She wasn't walking to justify herself. She was walking to be seen. As Emily stepped behind the pulpit, the heavy quiet of the chapel pressed against her chest. The polish beneath her fingers was smooth, worn by years of sermons and confessions. She stood there for a moment, her eyes scanning the faces before her. Rows of curious, guarded expressions stared back. Some skeptical, some surprised, some uncomfortable. The same people who had whispered about her just minutes ago now waited in absolute stillness. The space that had once felt suffocating with judgment had grown weightless with anticipation. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her throat was dry, her heartbeat relentless. She glanced at Pastor Miller, who gave her a slow nod of encouragement. That small gesture steadied her. She turned back to the congregation and took a deep breath. "My name is Emily," she began, her voice faint but clear. "I'm 27 years old. This is my first time here." There was no response, not even a murmur. The silence was total, almost reverent. "I didn't come here today to speak. I didn't even know if I'd stay past the first song." But then, she hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the pulpit. Something happened that I didn't expect. Someone in this church, the pastor, noticed I was here. Not just physically, but really here. And he asked me to speak, so I will. The atmosphere shifted, a collective leaning forward, an invisible tether forming between her and the people in front of her. Still, she didn't speak immediately. Her gaze moved from the middle pews to the far side, where a woman dabbed at her eyes with tissue. Then she returned her focus to her own story. "I grew up in a foster care system," she said, her voice now firmer, not loud but no longer uncertain. "I never knew my parents. I went from one house to another. Some kind, others not so kind. I learned early that people like me aren't expected to belong. We're expected to survive. And that's what I did." She paused, watching the effect of her words ripple across the room. A few people shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable, but others, especially those in the back rows, leaned in closer. I didn't have a stable home. I didn't finish school on time. And when I turned 18, I aged out of the system. I had no one, no job, no money, no place to go. Her fingers loosened slightly as she spoke, the weight of the words leaving her body as they left her mouth. "For a while, I lived in my car. When that was gone, I slept wherever I could. Shelters, sidewalks, sometimes stairwells of buildings no one watched." Emily's voice didn't waver. She wasn't crying. She had cried these tears long ago, alone in the dark. Now, what remained was the truth, and she offered it without embellishment or self-pity. "A few months ago," she continued, "someone from a local outreach program found me near a food bank. They offered me help. Not judgment, not rules, just help. They gave me a place to stay, a bed, a chance to start again. And I took it." She looked down briefly, then back at the congregation. "My clothes?" She gave a small nod, as if answering an unspoken question. "They're the only ones I own. They were given to me at the shelter. I washed them last night. I ironed this blouse this morning with an old iron in the common room. I didn't come here to make a statement. I came because I've been trying to believe that God hasn't forgotten me, that maybe there's still a place for someone like me." She swallowed hard and added, "I came here looking for peace." The stillness that followed wasn't just silent. It was stunned. The same rows of people who had assessed her appearance with suspicion were now visibly moved. Even the older woman who had spoken to her earlier sat rigidly in her pew, her eyes cast downward. The air in the chapel was thick with a kind of awakening, a slow crumbling of assumptions that had stood unchallenged for far too long. "I'm not asking for pity," Emily said after a moment. "I just wanted a seat to listen, a chance to be part of something, even for one morning. But when I walked in, I could feel the judgment. I could see it. and I almost walked out. She looked directly at the front row now, her gaze calm but unwavering. But then the pastor said something that made me feel like maybe this wasn't just another place where I didn't belong. She stepped back slightly from the microphone, letting the words settle. Her chest rose and fell slowly. Her fingers no longer trembled. "I know I don't look like most of you," she said finally, "but I'm trying. I'm trying to be better, to believe in something again, to heal. I only came to hear if someone like me could still be loved by God, not when I've cleaned up, not when I have a better job, not when I wear better clothes, but now, just now." And then she stopped speaking. There was no applause, no dramatic music, no scripted response. Just a silence so profound it bordered on sacred. She stepped away from the pulpit and began walking back toward her seat. But before she could even reach the second row, Pastor Miller rose from his chair. He didn't return to the pulpit. He didn't open his Bible or glance at his notes. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on Emily. "Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have said more in the last 5 minutes than I could say in an entire sermon." Then he turned to the congregation, his voice rising, not in anger, but in conviction. "And if you didn't feel the weight of her words just now, then I pray God breaks your heart wide open." The silence broke, not with chatter, but with a wave of quiet sobs. The weight of what had been revealed was too heavy to ignore. "We speak about grace every Sunday," the pastor said, still looking at his congregation. "We quote it, we sing about it, we decorate our walls with verses about it. But what good is grace if we fail to offer it to the very people who need it most?" He motioned to Emily gently. This woman walked in here with nothing but courage, and many of us responded with nothing but pride. There was no defensiveness in his tone, no venom, just truth, and truth often carried its own kind of sting. The pastor let the moment hang before he continued. "This morning was supposed to be about the book of James, but I think we just seen it lived out. Faith without works is dead, and judgment without love is just noise." Emily sat down again, her eyes lowered. But now, the glances that met her were different, softer, fuller, stripped of their earlier edges. No one said a word, because for once, the message hadn't come from the pulpit alone. When the service ended, a quiet unease lingered in the chapel. The usual rhythm of dismissal, polite chatter, gathering of children, the shuffle of feet toward the exits, was replaced with a stillness that refused to be broken. People sat in their pews longer than usual, processing. Some stared at the wooden cross hanging above the altar. Others looked at the floor, eyes unfocused. No one seemed in a hurry to leave. Something unspoken had shifted among them, and it wasn't just about Emily's clothes or her testimony. It was about what they had seen in themselves, mirrored in the way they had treated a stranger. Emily sat quietly at the edge of the last pew, her hands folded in her lap. A faint light from the stained glass windows painted colors on the floor near her feet. The pastor had resumed his seat near the pulpit, silent, head bowed. He hadn't tried to reclaim the moment with more words. There was nothing more to say. The message had already been delivered, and not by him. Eventually, people began moving, though not toward the exit. A man in his 40s, tall and broad-shouldered with calloused hands and a fading denim shirt, stood up and slowly approached Emily. He hesitated a few feet away, his voice low. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I saw you come in and thought you didn't belong. But I was the one who didn't see right." Emily nodded, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to apologies, least of all from strangers. Then came another, a woman with silver hair and soft eyes, holding a hymnal against her chest like a shield. "I've been coming here for 20 years, she said quietly, "and I can't remember the last time I felt as convicted as I did today. I judged you before I heard your name. That's not who I want to be." Emily looked at her, searching for sarcasm or condescension, but found none. The woman offered a small, genuine smile before stepping aside, allowing someone else to come forward. One by one, members of the congregation approached, not out of obligation, but from something deeper, something awakened. Some simply offered nods of acknowledgement, others gentle words. A few hugged her without asking, brief and sincere. The older woman who had spoken to her before the service stood several feet away, visibly unsure, then turned and walked toward the door. But just before leaving, she paused, looked back once, and lowered her head as if reconsidering. Outside the church, the parking lot was quiet. Cars remained where they were, their engines still cold. The Texas sky stretched wide and open, the heat of midday settling over the town. Emily stepped outside, the breeze tugging gently at her blouse. She stood at the edge of the steps, uncertain whether to leave immediately or linger. Pastor Miller joined her a few minutes later, his Bible tucked under his arm. He didn't speak right away. He just stood beside her, looking out across the horizon like he needed to ground himself in something solid. "May I?" he finally asked, gesturing to the steps. Emily nodded, and the two of them sat side by side, the stone warm beneath them. "I've been in ministry for over 25 years, he said, voice low and even. "I've written hundreds of sermons, baptized dozens of believers, and tried to live what I preach. But today, I think I learned more in 10 minutes than I have in years." Emily looked at him, skeptical but curious. "You think I taught you something?" she asked. He smiled, but it was a quiet smile, not performative. "You reminded me what the church is supposed to be, and what it's not." She let the silence sit between them for a moment before saying, "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't. You brought truth into the room. It just made some of us uncomfortable." They sat like that for a while. No pressure, no obligation to keep talking. Eventually, Emily stood, dusting off her jeans. "I don't know if I'll be back next week," she said honestly. "It's the lot." He nodded. "I understand, but I hope you do. And if you ever need anything, even just someone to sit beside you, I'll be here." She gave a small, thoughtful nod, then turned and began walking down the gravel path. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't even know where she'd be sleeping the following week. Her temporary housing had strict limits. But for the first time in a long while, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely alone in the world. What Emily didn't know was that her testimony that morning wouldn't stay confined to the church's four walls. Unbeknownst to her, a young woman named Rachel, who worked with the church's communications team, had been recording the service to later upload excerpts to the church's modest social media page. Moved beyond measure by what had unfolded, Rachel clipped a portion of Emily's testimony and the pastor's response into a short video. She hesitated before uploading it, unsure whether it was appropriate, but eventually did so, marking the post simply, "This morning, something real happened in our church." The video began circulating quietly at first. A few members of the congregation shared it, adding captions like, "A needed reminder," and "This is what grace looks like." Within hours, it began spreading beyond their circle. A friend of a friend reposted it to a larger group, then a pastor from another city. Then a national faith-based blog picked it up, calling it a necessary moment of reckoning for the modern church. By the end of the day, the video had been viewed tens of thousands of times. Comments poured in, some sharing their own stories of feeling unwelcome in churches, others expressing their admiration for Emily's courage and the pastor's humility. People who had long abandoned faith reached out to say they were reconsidering. Strangers from across the country sent messages to the church asking how they could help people like Emily in their own communities. Rachel watched it all unfold with wide eyes, hardly able to believe what had started in their small-town chapel. And at the center of it all was a young woman who had only wanted to find a quiet corner in the back row. Emily had not intended to speak. She had not meant to challenge anyone. But in telling her story, she had done more than move a room full of people. She had ignited something far beyond the walls of New Hope Community Chapel. Something real, something powerful, something that would not soon be forgotten. The following Sunday arrived with more tension than usual. The chapel, usually half filled by 10 o'clock in the morning, began to reach capacity well before the service officially started. Word had spread, and not just within the usual congregational circles. Strangers, visibly new, some hesitant, others expectant, filed in slowly, many of them dressed as plainly as Emily had been the previous week. A few had likely come out of curiosity, drawn by the viral video that now had over 100,000 views, but others carried in their faces something more familiar, a quiet hope that perhaps this church might be different. Pastor John Miller stood behind the curtain of his small office off to the side of the sanctuary, not yet ready to enter. He could hear the growing hum of voices, the scraping of pews, the occasional soft laugh of a child. In his hands was a folded piece of paper. He had rewritten it 3 times that week, never fully satisfied with the words. But it wasn't the language that troubled him. It was the weight of what it represented. He wasn't merely preparing a sermon. He was stepping forward to address something deeper, more personal, something he had never publicly confessed in all his years of ministry. He took a deep breath, adjusted his collar, and stepped to the side door. The sanctuary quieted almost immediately. He climbed the steps to the pulpit without his usual energy. There was no cheerful welcome, no casual greeting, no opening anecdote. He looked out over the crowded pews and saw not just familiar faces, but new ones, many of them seated close to the back, eyes guarded. And among them, Emily, sitting in the same spot as before, though this time flanked by 2 young women who had approached her earlier in the week. She met his gaze and gave a small, unreadable nod. The pastor unfolded the paper slowly and placed it on the pulpit, though he didn't glance at it. Instead, he began speaking from memory, his voice lower than usual but unmistakably steady. Last week, something happened in this sanctuary that I believe we will remember for the rest of our lives. Not because it was part of a planned sermon, not because of anything I said, but because a young woman spoke truth into a space that had forgotten how to make room for it. He paused, letting the weight of that sentence land. I am not proud of what happened before the service began that day. And though I did not speak those first words of judgment, I must take responsibility for the culture that allowed them to be spoken. I have led this congregation for over a decade. I have preached about grace, about humility, about the open arms of Christ. But somewhere along the way, I failed to examine whether we had become more focused on performance than presence. A stir moved through the room. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't restless. It was a collective inhale, a recognition that something rarely said from pulpits was now being confessed. I want to say this clearly, so that no one here misunderstands me, he continued, his hands resting on the sides of the lectern. We were wrong. I was wrong. And to Emily, and to anyone else who has ever walked into a church and felt unseen, unwelcome, or judged for what you wore, or how you spoke, or where you came from, I am sorry. Deeply and publicly sorry. His voice did not waver, even as emotion curled at its edges. He took a breath and went on. This church is not a museum for saints. It is a hospital for the broken. And if we've forgotten that, then we have no right to call ourselves followers of Christ. There was silence still, but not the uncomfortable kind. This was a silence of people leaning in, absorbing, grappling. Pastor Miller stepped away from the pulpit and looked out across the congregation. As of today, he said, we will be making changes, not symbolic ones, but real, structural changes to how we welcome, support, and walk alongside every person who comes through our doors. He then called forward the leadership team, who stood alongside him in a quiet line. Each of them had spent the week reviewing feedback, praying, and facing the reality of their own complicity. One by one, they spoke briefly, honestly, sharing not rehearsed apologies, but personal acknowledgments of how easy it had become to value comfort over compassion, familiarity over true hospitality. Emily remained seated through it all, quiet and still. She hadn't known any of this was planned. She had come that morning expecting nothing more than a typical service. But as the leadership spoke, and as the room shifted again from passive attendance to active reflection, she realized something extraordinary was happening. Not for show, not to ease guilt, but because something had genuinely broken open, and from that break, something new was trying to grow. When the formal service concluded, the pastor made one final invitation. Not an altar call in the traditional sense, but a communal act. He invited anyone who wished to come forward, not just to pray, but to sit in conversation with the newcomers who had joined them that day. The back pews emptied slowly. There were handshakes, small groups forming, circles of people kneeling together, and even quiet tears exchanged between those who had never spoken before. One elderly man approached Emily cautiously. His face was lined with age, his tie slightly crooked. He held a small envelope in his hands. "I don't know what you've been through," he said gently, "but I want to help in any way I can. My wife and I run a secondhand store. If you ever need clothes or anything else, come by. No charge." Emily looked at him, startled. She hadn't asked for anything. Not last week, not today. But she accepted the envelope, not for the money inside, but for what it represented. Kindness without condition. Later, as the crowd thinned and conversations continued in the fellowship hall, Pastor Miller found her once again. "I meant every word," he said. "I know," she replied. "There's a lot of work to do," he added, his tone shifting to something more determined. "There always is," she said quietly. And then, something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding that neither of them could have anticipated a week before. What began as a disruption had become an awakening, and though they didn't know what the coming weeks would bring, one thing was clear: the church would not return to what it had been. The moment had passed for that. Now it was time to rebuild. Weeks passed since the service that would forever alter New Hope Community Chapel. The chapel's rhythm, once predictable and contained, had begun to pulse with life in unexpected ways. Each Sunday, as the sun filtered through stained glass windows, new faces appeared. Some returned, hesitant at first, then more assured. Others never spoke, yet their mere presence, quiet, patient, observing, spoke volumes. Emily, too, continued attending, drawn by something she still couldn't fully name, but that felt like belonging. Her seating shifted. She no longer sat the back row, clutching the pew's edge, but nearer to the center, where she could see and be seen. She had also connected with the woman who ran the second-hand store. They arranged a meeting outside of church hours. Emily accepted donated clothes, not because she needed charity, but because the offer came wrapped in dignity. There was no pity, just kindness. The clothes themselves became more than fabric. They were threads stitching her into a community that had begun to see her. In the weeks that followed, Rachel, the church's communications volunteer, continued to post snippets of past services, always with Emily's permission. A short clip of the congregation gathering around her, a photo of Emily speaking with young children in the fellowship hall, a picture of the donated clothes neatly folded in the church's newly designated care cabinet. These were modest, honest glimpses, nothing staged, nothing sensational, but they resonated. People across the country and even beyond began writing messages, reaching out for guidance on how to cultivate such spaces in their own churches. Emails poured in, each one a plea for help and encouragement. Emily watched the responses sometimes, from a quiet corner of her modest temporary housing, where a small desk from the shelter provided the only surface she owned. She wasn't looking for praise, but when the messages came, full of gratitude and stories of their own rejection, she felt a shift in her chest, like the world had made room for her in ways she hadn't dared to imagine. One morning, she arrived early at the chapel. The air felt cooler, the pews freshly dusted, the windows catching the dawn light just so. A small gathering had formed. A few of the newer visitors, the leadership team, Pastor Miller. They were meeting before the service to plan the new outreach program they decided on after that public apology. The idea was simple. Once a month, the church would host an open welcome table after service. Anyone could join, eat, talk, receive a meal, clothes, or a listening ear. Volunteers signed up weekly. No one had to justify why they came. Pastor Miller greeted Emily softly, offering her a mug of coffee. She took it, hands closing around the warm ceramic, and watched as members set tables, arranged chairs, and laid out plates of food. The new posture of the church unfolded in those acts, small yet profound. A woman Emily didn't yet know approached her with a plate of muffins. "Emily," she asked, "I'm Hannah. I've been coming the last few weeks. I haven't felt church belonged to me in a long time. But coming here now, I want to help." She pointed at the muffins. "Would you help me serve?" Emily nodded, surprised to be considered. They moved together, distributing muffins to the earliest arrivals, newcomers and regulars alike. When the service began, the chapel held a different energy. The sermon remained rooted in grace, but it no longer felt abstract. It breathed through the room, embodied by the people. The music was familiar, But something in the harmonies resonated deeper. Perhaps it was a knowledge that voices once silent had come forward and were being heard. After the final hymn, as people moved toward the fellowship hall, Emily paused as she saw a small circle formed near the welcome table. A young man, college age and wearing a backpack, shyly approached the table and accepted a sandwich from a volunteer. He stood there, head bowed, as someone placed a hand gently on his back. Emily took a step forward and offered him a smile. He looked up, tentative, tired, and returned the gesture. She told him quietly, "I'm Emily. We're glad you're here." He swallowed and said, "Thank you." That moment felt like something sacred. Two strangers connecting in a broken world, stitched together by a simple acknowledgement. A month later, the welcome table had drawn in over 24 people, some just to chat, some because they needed help, some because they hadn't stepped into a church in years. Conversations happened about jobs, about housing, about grief, about hope. Pastoral staff listened. Volunteers gave out numbers of shelters, places to fill out applications, people who cared. No agendas, just presence. By then, Emily had begun informal mentoring with a small group of girls from the town's high school, girls who struggled with homelessness or had aged out of foster care. She helped them with homework, shared her story, listened to theirs. She wasn't a pastor. She was just someone who had once walked in with shame and now offered empathy. In return, she felt the warmth of shared purpose that felt both gentle and radical. The leadership team had also begun adjusting how newcomers were welcomed. No longer just a pamphlet and a greeting from a well-intentioned greeter, but a genuine invitation to sit and stay. A reinvention of hospitality. As the months progressed, the social media reach continued to grow. The church website featured not polished sermons or shiny announcements, but real stories of Emily, of newcomers, of meals shared, of healing begun small and spreading. Other churches reached out, asking how to replicate this ministry. Pastor Miller began hosting phone calls with these churches, sharing lessons learned, mistakes made, joys discovered. One afternoon, Emily entered the fellowship hall to find a collection of used textbooks on a table labeled, "Take one if you need one." She smiled, recognizing that someone had remembered her mention of finishing school late, of needing books. She ran her hand over the worn covers, each one a possibility. She picked up a grade-level textbook and walked the back room where the mentoring sessions happened. She carried it upstairs to a young girl who had been struggling with math. The girl's eyes widened and she hugged the book. Emily squeezed her shoulder and said softly, "You can do this." In that moment, her own voice felt stronger because it echoed hope, not need. For Emily, the journey was far from over. She still had uncertain housing. She still had days when the weight of the past pressed close. But now, she carried something more durable than clothes or thank you notes. She carried a purpose rooted in shared story. In the chapel's quiet moments before Sunday services, during lunch quietly stirring, she would sometimes find Pastor Miller observing the room. They never spoke those moments out loud. No captions, no applause, but each recognized that they had witnessed something uncommon, a transformation of a community through the courage of a woman and the humility of a pastor. Occasionally, Pastor Miller would say, "Thank you," quietly, and she would answer, "Thank you for listening." The story that began with shame and unexpected testimony had become something far greater. It had become a living example of grace in motion, not perfect, messy, real, and spreading, not just within the chapel walls, but out into a world desperate for acceptance. In that movement, Emily and her church found a new way forward, one forged in vulnerability, compassion, and relentless hope.